The Sackler family name once evoked images of philanthropy, high culture, and prestige. Their donations adorned the walls of the world's most celebrated museums, their names etched into marble plaques in institutions of art and science. But beneath this polished veneer lay a dark truth, a legacy built not on generosity, but on greed and death. This is the story of how one family's insatiable hunger for wealth unleashed a plague upon society, leaving hundreds of thousands dead in its wake and millions more trapped in the shadowy grip of addiction. The story begins in the United States, a country already grappling with a complex relationship to prescription drugs. It was the late 1990s, when whispers of a new miracle painkiller began to circulate among doctors and pharmaceutical representatives. The drug was OxyContin, a creation of Purdue Pharma, a company controlled by the Sackler family. Marketed as a revolutionary solution to chronic pain, OxyContin promised patients relief without the risk of addiction, a claim that would later prove to be a catastrophic lie. At the center of this unfolding tragedy was Arthur Sackler, the patriarch whose marketing genius had laid the foundation for his family's empire. Though Arthur himself would not live to see OxyContin's rise, his methods were immortalized in Purdue Pharma's playbook. He had pioneered aggressive pharmaceutical advertising tactics in the 1950s, transforming how drugs were marketed to physicians. His approach was simple, yet devastatingly effective. Target doctors with lavish gifts, manipulate scientific data to downplay risks, and create a narrative that positioned the drug as indispensable. His successors, his brothers Mortimer and Raymond Sackler, took these strategies to new heights, weaponizing them in ways that would forever alter the landscape of public health. By 1996, Purdue Pharma launched OxyContin with an unprecedented marketing campaign. Sales representatives were trained to push the drug relentlessly, armed with misleading charts and studies that claimed its time-release formula made it less addictive than other opioids. Doctors were incentivized to prescribe it for even minor ailments like back pain or migraines. The company targeted rural areas hardest hit by economic decline, where manual laborers suffering from chronic pain became easy prey. Billboards promising freedom from pain sprang up along highways in Appalachia. Glossy brochures flooded clinics and hospitals. But behind these promises lurked a sinister reality. OxyContin's time-release mechanism was easily bypassed by crushing the pills, allowing users to experience an intense euphoric high. Addiction rates soared as patients who initially sought relief from legitimate pain found themselves spiraling into dependency. Overdose deaths began to climb at an alarming rate, but Purdue Pharma dismissed these warnings as anecdotal outliers. The Sacklers themselves remained insulated from the chaos they had unleashed. From their mansions in Greenwich and Manhattan penthouses, they watched their fortunes grow exponentially. They poured millions into art galleries and universities, ensuring their name became synonymous with cultural excellence rather than corporate malfeasance. To them, addiction was not a public health crisis, but merely a cost of doing business. As OxyContin's grip tightened on communities across America, a new wave of despair began to take hold. Families were torn apart as loved ones succumbed to overdoses or turned to crime to feed their addiction. Small towns became epicenters of what would later be called the opioid epidemic, a crisis so vast it would claim over 500,000 lives within 2 decades. One such town was Pine Hollow, nestled deep in West Virginia's coal mining region. Once a thriving community built on hard work and resilience, Pine Hollow had become emblematic of the devastation wrought by OxyContin. Its residents were no strangers to pain. Years of backbreaking labor had left many with chronic injuries. When local doctors began prescribing OxyContin as a miracle cure, it seemed like salvation had finally arrived. Among Pine Hollow's residents was Mary Carter, a widowed mother of 3 who worked double shifts at the local diner to make ends meet. Mary had injured her back lifting heavy trays years earlier, but had soldiered on despite the pain. When her doctor handed her a prescription for OxyContin, assuring her it was safe and effective, she felt hopeful for the first time in years. Within weeks, Mary's life began to unravel as dependency took hold, her once vibrant spirit replaced by desperation and shame. Mary's story was not unique. It was echoed in countless households across America. Yet for every life destroyed by addiction, Purdue Pharma continued to rake in billions in profits. The Sacklers remained untouchable, shielded by layers of lawyers and public relations experts who deflected blame onto users themselves. But cracks were beginning to form in their carefully constructed facade. Investigative journalists started digging into Purdue's marketing practices. Whistleblowers came forward with damning evidence of corporate misconduct. Lawsuits piled up as states and municipalities sought accountability for the devastation wrought by OxyContin. Still, the Sacklers showed no remorse. In private emails uncovered years later during litigation, family members dismissed addiction victims as criminals or weak-willed. They doubled down on their efforts to expand internationally, targeting new markets in Europe and Asia where regulations were less stringent. As public outrage grew louder and lawsuits threatened to expose their culpability on an unprecedented scale, one question loomed large. Would justice ever catch up with the Sacklers, or would they succeed in rewriting history once again, casting themselves as benevolent benefactors rather than architects of one of America's deadliest epidemics? The stage was set for a battle that would pit ordinary citizens against one of the most powerful families in modern history, a fight not just for accountability, but for survival itself. The opioid epidemic did not erupt overnight. It spread like a slow, insidious poison, infiltrating every corner of American society. By the early 2000s, OxyContin had become a household name, not for its promise of pain relief, but for the destruction it left in its wake. The Sackler family, however, remained untouched by the chaos they had unleashed. From their gilded towers, they continued to profit from the misery of millions, their wealth growing as communities crumbled under the weight of addiction. In Pine Hollow, West Virginia, the devastation was palpable. The once thriving coal town had become a shadow of its former self. Storefronts were boarded up, schools struggled to function with dwindling resources, and the local morgue overflowed with victims of overdose. Mary Carter's descent into addiction mirrored that of her neighbors. What began as a prescription to manage her back pain quickly spiraled into something far darker. Her days became a blur of pill bottles and desperate attempts to find her next dose. The money she earned at the diner vanished into the black hole of her dependency, leaving her children to fend for themselves. Mary's eldest son, Luke, just 16 years old, took on the role of caregiver for his younger siblings. He watched helplessly as his mother transformed from a hard-working woman into a hollow shell of herself. The laughter that once filled their modest home was replaced by silence and muffled sobs behind closed doors. Luke knew his mother wasn't alone in her struggle. Nearly every family in Pine Hollow had been touched by OxyContin in some way. Friends he'd grown up with dropped out of school or turned to petty crime to support their parents or their own addictions. The town's doctor, Dr. Alan Reeves, bore his own burden of guilt. A well-meaning physician who had initially believed Purdue Pharma's claims about OxyContin's safety, Reeves had prescribed it liberally to his patients, many of whom were miners or laborers suffering from chronic pain. When he began noticing alarming patterns, patients returning for higher doses far sooner than expected or exhibiting signs of dependency, he reached out to Purdue representatives for guidance. They assured him there was no cause for concern and encouraged him to continue prescribing. But Reeves couldn't ignore what was happening around him. By 2003, he had stopped prescribing OxyContin altogether and began advocating for stricter regulations on opioids. His efforts earned him scorn from Purdue Pharma's sales team and even threats from powerful figures within the pharmaceutical industry. Yet he persisted, haunted by the faces of patients he'd unwittingly condemned to addiction. Meanwhile, investigative journalists were beginning to piece together the puzzle of Purdue Pharma's role in the crisis. Among them was Sarah Whitaker, a reporter for a regional newspaper who had spent years covering stories on Appalachia's economic struggles. When she started noticing an uptick in obituaries citing overdose deaths, many involving OxyContin, she decided to dig deeper. Sarah's investigation led her to Pine Hollow, where she interviewed families like Mary's and healthcare professionals like Dr. Reeves. What she uncovered was staggering: internal Purdue documents revealing that company executives had known about OxyContin's addictive potential from the very beginning, but had chosen to suppress this information in favor of profit. She also discovered evidence of aggressive lobbying efforts aimed at preventing government regulation and silencing critics. As Sarah's articles gained national attention, they sparked outrage across the country. Lawsuits against Purdue Pharma multiplied as states sought restitution for the billions spent combating the epidemic. Yet despite mounting evidence against them, the Sacklers remained defiant. They hired high-powered legal teams to shield themselves from accountability and continued funneling money into offshore accounts. In Pine Hollow, however, resistance was growing. Luke Carter became an unlikely leader in his community's fight against Purdue Pharma. Frustrated by the lack of action from local authorities and inspired by Sarah Whitaker's reporting, he organized town meetings where residents could share their stories and strategize ways to hold the Sacklers accountable. Dr. Reeves joined forces with Luke, using his medical expertise to educate others about the dangers of opioids and advocate for alternative treatments for pain management. Together with Sarah Whitaker, they formed a coalition that aimed to bring national attention not just to Pine Hollow's plight, but to the broader epidemic ravaging America. Their efforts culminated in a protest outside Purdue Pharma's headquarters, a powerful symbol of defiance from those who had been dismissed as collateral damage in the Sacklers' pursuit of wealth. Hundreds gathered with signs bearing messages like, "Our lives are not for sale," and "Justice for the victims." Among them were families who had lost loved ones to overdoses and survivors who had managed to break free from addiction. The Sacklers responded with characteristic arrogance, dismissing the protesters as misguided and accusing them of seeking scapegoats for their own failures. But behind closed doors, cracks were beginning to show within the family itself. Internal emails revealed divisions among members over how best to handle the growing backlash. Some advocated for settling lawsuits quietly, while others insisted on fighting tooth and nail to protect their fortune. As public pressure mounted and lawsuits threatened to expose their darkest secrets, one thing became clear: this was no longer just a battle over money or accountability. It was a fight for justice against one of history's most insidious crimes. The stage was set for an epic showdown between ordinary citizens seeking redemption and a family whose greed knew no bounds. A conflict that would test not only their resolve, but also their faith in humanity itself. The opioid epidemic was not just a story of numbers or statistics. It was a deeply personal tragedy that tested the bonds between families, friends, and communities. In Pine Hollow, the crisis brought out both the best and worst in people, forging unlikely alliances while exposing deep fractures. At the center of it all was Mary Carter's family, struggling to hold itself together as addiction threatened to tear them apart. Luke Carter had grown up too fast. At just 16, he became the de facto head of his household, a role he neither wanted nor felt prepared for. His mother, Mary, once a pillar of strength, had become a shadow of her former self. Luke's younger siblings, 10-year-old Emma and 8-year-old Ben, looked to him for stability, their wide eyes silently pleading for reassurance that everything would be okay. But Luke had no answers. He spent his days juggling school part-time, work at the local grocery store, and caring for his siblings, all while trying to keep his mother's addiction a secret from the outside world. Mary's addiction had turned her into someone unrecognizable. The woman who used to pack lunches, with handwritten notes of encouragement, now spent her days locked in her bedroom, curtains drawn against the light. On rare occasions when she emerged, her movements were sluggish, her speech slurred. Luke resented her for abandoning them, but also pitied her. He could see the shame etched into her face whenever she caught his eye. She knew she was failing them, but the pull of OxyContin was stronger than her love for herself, or so it seemed. Dr. Alan Reeves became an unexpected source of support for the Carter family. Guilt-ridden over his role in prescribing OxyContin to patients like Mary, he made it his mission to help those affected by the epidemic in any way he could. He began visiting the Carters regularly, offering medical advice and emotional support. For Luke, Reeves became a mentor of sorts, a figure who understood the weight of responsibility and shared his determination to fight back against Purdue Pharma. Reeves also took a special interest in Emma and Ben, recognizing how vulnerable they were in such a chaotic environment. He encouraged them to focus on their education and even arranged for scholarships to ensure they could attend school without financial strain. For Mary, Reeves represented both hope and a painful reminder of what she had lost. She avoided him whenever possible, unable to face the man who had once been her trusted doctor, but now symbolized everything that had gone wrong. Meanwhile, Sarah Whitaker's relationship with Pine Hollow deepened as she continued her investigation into Purdue Pharma. What began as a journalistic assignment evolved into something far more personal as she formed bonds with families like the Carters. Sarah saw herself in Luke. Both were driven by a sense of duty and a desire to expose the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Sarah's presence in Pine Hollow was met with mixed reactions. Some residents welcomed her efforts to shine a light on their struggles. Others viewed her as an outsider exploiting their pain for headlines. But Sarah was undeterred. She spent hours listening to people's stories, documenting their heartbreak and resilience with meticulous care. Her articles humanized the epidemic in ways that statistics never could, putting faces and names to the crisis. One of Sarah's most poignant interviews came from Ruth Miller, an elderly widow who had lost both her son and grandson to OxyContin overdoses. Ruth's story was one of quiet devastation, a life marked by loss, but also by an unyielding determination to honor their memory by fighting back against Purdue Pharma. Ruth became a surrogate grandmother to Luke and his siblings, offering them comfort and wisdom when they needed it most. As these relationships deepened, so too did tensions within Pine Hollow. Not everyone supported Luke's efforts to organize protests or draw attention to their plight. Some residents feared retaliation from powerful entities like Purdue Pharma. Others simply wanted to move on with their lives and forget about the past. The divide created rifts within the community that mirrored those within families like the Carters. Luke found himself at odds with his best friend, Jake Turner, whose father worked as a sales representative for Purdue Pharma. Jake defended his father's actions, arguing that he was just doing his job and couldn't be held responsible for what happened after doctors prescribed OxyContin. Their friendship strained under the weight of these disagreements until it finally broke during an argument at school. "You don't get it," Luke snapped one day, after Jake accused him of being obsessed with blaming Purdue Pharma for everything wrong in Pine Hollow. "Your dad gets paid while my mom dies a little more every day because of what they sell." Jake's face reddened with anger and shame, but he said nothing in return. Their friendship ended that day, a casualty of a crisis neither boy could fully comprehend. Despite these challenges, moments of hope emerged amidst the darkness. The coalition formed by Luke, Dr. Reeves, and Sarah Whitaker began gaining traction beyond Pine Hollow. Other towns affected by the opioid epidemic reached out to share their stories and joined forces in demanding accountability from Purdue Pharma and the Sacklers. Luke also found solace in small victories at home. Emma winning first place in her school's science fair, Ben scoring his first goal in a soccer game, Mary agreeing to attend one of Dr. Reeves's support group meetings for recovering addicts. These moments reminded him why he fought so hard to give his siblings a chance at a better future and to save his mother from herself. But even as these relationships strengthened Luke's resolve, they also exposed him to new vulnerabilities. The closer he grew to people like Sarah Whitaker or Dr. Reeves, the more he feared losing them, either to burnout or retaliation from those who sought to silence their efforts. The opioid epidemic was not just about pills or profits, it was about people, their pain, their resilience, their capacity for love, even in the face of unimaginable loss. For Luke Carter and those around him, it was also about finding strength in each other as they prepared for what lay ahead, a battle against one of the most powerful families in America. As the opioid crisis continued to ravage Pine Hollow and communities across America, the growing movement against Purdue Pharma reached a boiling point. The coalition led by Luke Carter, Dr. Alan Reeves, and Sarah Whitaker had gained significant momentum, drawing attention from national media outlets and advocacy groups. Their efforts culminated in a planned protest at Purdue Pharma's headquarters in Connecticut, a bold act of defiance that would serve as both a rallying cry for those affected by the epidemic and a direct challenge to the Sacklers' power. In the weeks leading up to the protest, excitement mingled with anxiety among the coalition members. They organized logistics, coordinated transportation for those willing to travel, and spread the word through social media. Luke felt a surge of hope as he watched his community come together, united by a common purpose. Yet beneath that hope lay an undercurrent of fear. They were about to confront an entity that had historically silenced dissenters and wielded immense influence over public perception. On the day of the protest, a palpable energy filled the air. As buses arrived from neighboring towns carrying families who had been touched by addiction, survivors held signs emblazoned with powerful messages: "Stop the lies, our pain is not profit, and justice for our loved ones." Luke stood at the forefront, heart pounding with anticipation. This was it, the moment they would make their voices heard. As they marched toward Purdue Pharma's headquarters, chants erupted from the crowd, echoing off the glass and steel facade of the building. Luke felt a rush of adrenaline as he led them in unison, fueled by anger and grief. The sight of so many people, mothers, fathers, siblings, who had lost loved ones to OxyContin, filled him with determination. They were no longer alone. They were part of something larger than themselves. But as they reached the entrance, reality set in. Security personnel emerged, creating a barrier between the protesters and the building. Tensions escalated as demonstrators pushed forward, demanding accountability from those responsible for their suffering. Luke's heart raced as he took in the scene. The raw emotion on display contrasted sharply with the cold indifference of corporate representatives watching from behind closed doors. Then came the moment that would change everything. A group of protesters attempted to breach the security line, shouting for justice and demanding to speak with someone from Purdue Pharma. In response, security guards moved in forcefully, pushing back against the crowd. Chaos erupted as people began shouting louder, some crying out for their lost loved ones, while others tried to maintain order. In that instant, Luke felt a surge of urgency. He pushed through the throng of bodies toward the front lines, determined to keep his community focused on their message rather than descending into violence. But before he could reach them, he caught sight of something that made his blood run cold: a group of armed police officers arriving on scene. The sight of law enforcement sent shockwaves through the crowd. Fear rippled among protesters who had come seeking justice, but now faced potential arrest or worse. Luke's mind raced as he realized how quickly their peaceful demonstration could turn into a confrontation with serious consequences. "Everyone, stay calm," he shouted, raising his hands in an attempt to quell rising tensions. "We're here for our loved ones. Let's not give them what they want." But his words were drowned out by angry shouts and cries for justice. The police began issuing warnings for dispersal, while some protesters defiantly refused to back down. Amidst this turmoil, Luke spotted his younger siblings at the edge of the crowd, Emma clutching her sign tightly, while Ben looked frightened and confused. Panic surged within him as he fought against instinctive fear. He couldn't let his siblings be caught up in this chaos. He made his way through the crowd toward them, heart pounding with every step. "Emma, Ben!" he called out as he reached them, kneeling to meet their wide-eyed gazes. "We need to get out of here. It's not safe." "But we can't leave," Emma protested, her voice trembling with indignation. "We have to stand up for Mom." "I know," Luke replied urgently, glancing back at the escalating situation behind him, where officers were beginning to make arrests. "But we can fight another day. Right now, we need to get you both home." Before Emma could respond, a loud crack echoed through the air. A flashbang grenade deployed by police aimed at dispersing crowds erupted nearby. Panic ensued as people screamed and scrambled in every direction. The chaos intensified as officers moved in aggressively to clear protesters from the area. "Run!" Luke shouted instinctively as he grabbed Emma's hand and pulled Ben close beside him. They darted away from the fray, weaving through terrified bodies and desperate cries for help. As they fled towards safety, Luke felt a sense of loss wash over him, not just for what they had hoped to achieve that day, but also for what it meant to confront such powerful forces without any real protection or support. The protest had been intended as a moment of unity, a stand against greed, but it had devolved into chaos before their eyes. Later that evening, back home in Pine Hollow, Luke sat on his bed, staring blankly at his phone screen, while Emma and Ben played quietly nearby. He felt defeated. All their efforts seemed futile against an enemy that wielded so much power and influence. But then came a knock on his door. Dr. Reeves entered with an expression that mixed concern and determination. "I heard about what happened today," he said softly but firmly. "I know it didn't go as planned." Luke nodded silently, feeling tears prick at his eyes. "But this isn't over," Dr. Reeves continued resolutely. "You inspired so many people today, even if it didn't end how we wanted it to." Luke looked up at him, searching for hope amidst despair. "People are starting to listen," Dr. Reeves added earnestly. "We can't give up now." In that moment, something shifted within Luke. He realized that while they may have faced setbacks today, real struggles against powerful adversaries, their fight was far from over. The point of no return had been crossed. There was no going back now, only forward into an uncertain future filled with challenges, yet also opportunities for change. In the aftermath of the chaotic protest, Pine Hollow felt like a town on the brink. The echoes of anger and despair lingered in the air, but amid the wreckage, a new resolve began to take shape. Luke Carter, still reeling from the day's events, found himself at a crossroads. The fear that had gripped him during the protest was now replaced by a fierce determination to continue the fight against Purdue Pharma and the Sacklers. He understood that their struggle was not just for his mother or his family, it was for every person whose life had been shattered by addiction. The following weeks were challenging. The protest had garnered national media attention, but it also attracted scrutiny and backlash. Some townspeople were wary of Luke's activism, fearing further repercussions from powerful forces. The local newspaper published articles questioning the motives behind the protest, suggesting that it had been more about seeking attention than achieving real change. This criticism stung deeply, but Luke refused to let it deter him. Instead, he focused on building a stronger coalition. Inspired by Dr. Reeves's unwavering support and Sarah Whitaker's journalistic integrity, he organized community meetings to discuss next steps. He invited families affected by addiction to share their stories, creating a safe space for healing and solidarity. Slowly but surely, more residents began to attend these gatherings. Mothers who had lost children, fathers grappling with their own dependencies, and siblings like Luke, who were desperate to make sense of their loved ones' struggles. One evening, as they sat in a circle in the old community center, Mary Carter finally found the courage to speak up. It had been weeks since she had attended any gathering outside her home. Shame had kept her away. But after hearing Luke's passionate pleas for change and witnessing his growing determination, she felt compelled to confront her own demons. "I'm sorry," she began, her voice trembling as tears streamed down her cheeks. "I've let this drug take over my life and ruin our family." She paused, looking around at the faces filled with empathy and understanding. "I want to fight back too." Her words resonated deeply within the room. Many nodded in agreement. They had all experienced similar feelings of guilt and helplessness. In that moment of vulnerability, Mary became a beacon of hope for others who felt trapped in their own struggles. As Mary began attending support groups and therapy sessions facilitated by Dr. Reeves, she slowly started reclaiming her life. Each small victory, a day without pills, an honest conversation with Luke, became milestones on her path to recovery. The transformation was gradual but profound. She began to engage more with her children and even volunteered at local events aimed at raising awareness about addiction. Meanwhile, Luke's leadership grew stronger as he navigated the complexities of activism. He reached out to other towns affected by OxyContin addiction, forging connections with grassroots organizations dedicated to fighting the opioid crisis. With Sarah Whitaker's help, they organized a larger rally set for later that year, a gathering that would bring together communities from across the state to demand accountability from Purdue Pharma. As preparations for the rally intensified, Luke faced new challenges. Fundraising efforts were met with skepticism from local businesses, wary of backlash from Purdue representatives. Some community members questioned whether their voices could truly make a difference against such a powerful adversary. But through it all, Luke remained steadfast in his belief that change was possible. He drew strength from his mother's recovery journey and the growing support network they had built together. Each story shared at their meetings fueled his determination. Each face in the crowd reminded him of why they were fighting. The day of the rally arrived with an electric atmosphere buzzing through Pine Hollow. Buses filled with supporters came from neighboring towns, families holding signs emblazoned with names of loved ones lost to addiction, and slogans demanding justice for victims of Purdue Pharma's negligence. As Luke stood before the crowd, gathered in front of the courthouse, his heart racing with anticipation, he could hardly believe how far they had come since that chaotic protest months earlier. This time felt different. There was an undeniable sense of unity among those gathered. "Today," he began passionately, "we stand together not just as individuals, but as a community united against greed. We are here for our loved ones who have suffered and those who continue to fight every single day." Cheers erupted from the crowd as people raised their signs high above their heads, a sea of voices echoing one powerful message: no more silence, no more suffering. With each speech delivered that day by mothers like Mary, sharing their journeys through addiction and recovery, by advocates like Dr. Reeves calling for systemic change, The rally transformed into something much larger than any one individual could have imagined. It became a movement, a testament to resilience in the face of adversity. As evening fell over Pine Hollow after an inspiring day filled with hope and determination, Luke felt an overwhelming sense of pride wash over him, not just for what they had accomplished, but also for how far they had all come together as a community. In those moments spent surrounded by people who understood their pain firsthand, the laughter mingling with tears, the realization struck him. This fight was not just about seeking justice against Purdue Pharma or holding the Sacklers accountable. It was about healing wounds, both personal and collective. The journey ahead would undoubtedly be fraught with challenges. Legal battles against one of America's most powerful families loomed large on the horizon, but now they faced it together. Luke knew deep down that while they might stumble along the way or encounter setbacks, they would rise again stronger than ever before because they carried each other's stories within them, stories woven together like threads, forming an unbreakable tapestry of resilience. The rally in Pine Hollow marked a pivotal moment in the fight against the opioid epidemic, igniting a fire of activism that spread beyond the small town and into the national consciousness. The media coverage was extensive, with news outlets broadcasting the stories of families devastated by addiction and highlighting the growing movement demanding accountability from Purdue Pharma and the Sacklers. Luke Carter had become a symbol of hope for many, but he also felt the weight of expectation pressing down on him. In the weeks following the rally, momentum continued to build. Lawsuits against Purdue Pharma multiplied, and public scrutiny intensified. The Sacklers, once untouchable in their wealth and influence, began to feel the pressure as state attorneys general launched investigations into their business practices. But with this newfound attention came threats, both subtle and overt, from those who sought to protect their interests. One evening, as Luke was preparing for another community meeting, he received an unexpected phone call. It was Sarah Whitaker, her voice laced with urgency. "Luke, you need to meet me at the diner. I've got something important to discuss." When Luke arrived at the diner, he found Sarah sitting in a booth, her expression grave. "I've uncovered some documents that could change everything," she said, sliding a folder across the table. "These emails from Purdue Pharma executives reveal their awareness of OxyContin's addictive potential long before it was ever marketed." Luke's heart raced as he leafed through the pages filled with damning evidence. The emails detailed discussions among Purdue executives about how to downplay addiction risks while maximizing profits, a clear indication that they had prioritized financial gain over public health. "This could be what we need to turn the tide," Luke said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But we have to be careful. If they catch wind of this—" "They already know we're onto them," Sarah interrupted, her eyes narrowing with determination. "But we can't back down now. We need to get this information out there, expose them for what they really are." With renewed purpose, Luke and Sarah devised a plan to release the documents to major news outlets, while simultaneously preparing for a press conference that would showcase their findings. They knew they were taking a significant risk. Purdue Pharma would likely retaliate fiercely against anyone who threatened their empire. As they worked tirelessly to prepare for the press conference, tensions escalated within Pine Hollow. Some residents began receiving anonymous threats, warning them to stay silent or face consequences. Luke's own family received a disturbing message one night. A note slipped under their door, reading, "Keep your mouth shut or suffer the consequences." Fear coursed through Luke's veins as he shared the news with his mother and siblings. Mary's recovery had been hard-won. She was finally beginning to reclaim her life after years of addiction. The thought of putting her or his siblings in danger made his stomach churn. "We can't let them intimidate us," Luke insisted, his voice steady despite his fear. "We're fighting for our lives here." Mary looked at him with concern, but also pride. She had witnessed her son grow from a scared boy into a courageous leader, willing to confront powerful adversaries head-on. The day of the press conference arrived, and Luke stood before a sea of reporters gathered outside Pine Hollow's town hall, flanked by Sarah and Dr. Reeves. As cameras flashed and microphones were thrust forward, he felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility wash over him. "Today," he began, his voice firm and resolute, "we stand united against a corporation that has profited from our pain and suffering for far too long." He gestured toward Sarah as she held up copies of the incriminating emails. "These documents reveal that Purdue Pharma knew OxyContin was dangerous long before it hit the market, and yet they chose profit over people." Gasps rippled through the crowd as reporters began feverishly taking notes and capturing footage. The gravity of what they were revealing hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. As Luke continued speaking passionately about the impact of addiction on families like his own, about lives lost and futures stolen, he noticed movement at the edge of the crowd. A group of individuals dressed in suits approached, flanked by security personnel who scanned the area with wary eyes. It was a delegation from Purdue Pharma. "Mr. Carter," one man called out, stepping forward with an air of authority that demanded attention. "We'd like to speak with you privately." Luke's heart raced. He recognized this as a pivotal moment, a test of his resolve against powerful forces seeking to silence him. "No!" Sarah interjected fiercely, stepping beside Luke protectively. "You don't get to intimidate us anymore." The tension escalated as reporters shifted their focus toward this unexpected confrontation. Cameras captured every moment, the faces of those who had suffered juxtaposed against representatives from a corporation that had profited from their pain. "Let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be," another executive said, smoothly, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "We believe in dialogue and resolution." Luke felt anger boiling within him. He could no longer remain passive while they tried to manipulate the situation. "Dialogue?" he shouted, back defiantly. "You've had your chance. You've ignored our pain for years. This isn't about dialogue. It's about accountability." The crowd erupted into applause as people rallied behind him. Families who had lost loved ones stood together in solidarity against those who sought only to protect their interests. Suddenly, chaos erupted when one protester broke through security lines and lunged toward Purdue representatives, shouting accusations about greed and negligence. In an instant, police officers moved in quickly to restore order while tensions flared among attendees, watching helplessly. "Get back!" shouted an officer as people surged forward, trying to defend their right to speak out against injustice. Amidst the turmoil surrounding them, the clash between those demanding justice and those determined to maintain control, Luke realized this was not just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had suffered at Purdue Pharma's hands. As officers attempted to contain the situation around him, pushing back protesters while attempting negotiations, Luke felt something shift within himself. A sense of clarity washed over him like never before. This fight would not end here. It would continue until every voice was heard, until every story mattered, until justice prevailed against those who had caused so much suffering. In that moment of chaos, amidst shouts for justice echoing through Pine Hollow, Luke knew they were on the brink of something monumental, a reckoning that could change everything for families like his own forever. The chaos of the press conference reverberated far beyond Pine Hollow. News outlets across the country picked up the story, broadcasting images of Luke Carter standing defiantly against Purdue Pharma representatives. The confrontation became a symbol of the growing resistance against the opioid epidemic, igniting discussions about corporate accountability and public health on a national scale. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift. Purdue, Pharma's stock prices began to plummet as investors grew wary of the mounting legal challenges and public backlash. The Sacklers, once shielded by their wealth and influence, found themselves increasingly isolated as more voices joined, the chorus demanding justice for those affected by their products. But with this newfound momentum came new threats. Luke received anonymous messages warning him to back down, and he noticed an unsettling presence around town. Unmarked cars parked outside his home, unfamiliar faces lurking near school events. The fear that had once gripped him now morphed into a steely resolve. He refused to let intimidation dictate his actions. As the coalition continued to grow, Luke and Sarah organized a series of town hall meetings to educate residents about their rights and the ongoing legal battles against Purdue Pharma. They invited lawyers specializing in opioid litigation to speak, empowering families with knowledge about how they could join the fight for justice. Each meeting drew larger crowds, with people sharing their stories of loss and resilience, creating an atmosphere of solidarity that bolstered their resolve. One evening, as Luke prepared for another meeting at the community center, he received a call from Dr. Reeves. "Luke, I think you need to see this," he said urgently. When Luke arrived at Dr. Reeves' office, he found the doctor poring over a stack of documents. "These are internal reports from Purdue Pharma," he explained. "They detail how they manipulated data about OxyContin's safety and effectiveness." Luke's heart raced as he scanned the pages filled with alarming statistics and internal communications that revealed a deliberate effort to mislead doctors and patients alike. "This is it," he breathed, realizing the magnitude of what they had uncovered. "We can use this in our case against them." Dr. Reeves nodded gravely. "But we need to act fast. If they catch wind of this, they'll do everything in their power to bury it." Fueled by urgency, Luke and Dr. Reeves contacted Sarah to share their findings. Together, they formulated a plan to release this information to the press, while simultaneously filing it as evidence in ongoing lawsuits against Purdue Pharma. The day they went public with the internal reports marked a significant turning point in their fight. News outlets ran headlines that exposed Purdue's deceptive practices, revealing how they had knowingly misled both doctors and patients about OxyContin's dangers. The Sacklers' carefully crafted image began to crumble as public outrage reached a fever pitch. As more families came forward with their stories, many having lost loved ones due to overdose, the pressure mounted on Purdue Pharma to respond. In an attempt to quell the growing storm, company executives issued statements claiming they were committed to addressing the opioid crisis and supporting recovery efforts. But for Luke and his allies, these statements felt hollow, a desperate attempt at damage control rather than genuine accountability. With each passing day, more communities joined Pine Hollow's fight against Purdue Pharma. Activists from across the country converged on state capitals, demanding legislative change aimed at regulating opioid prescriptions and holding pharmaceutical companies accountable for their role in the crisis. Amidst this whirlwind of activism, Luke found himself facing personal challenges as well. His relationship with Emma and Ben became strained. They were grappling with their own feelings about their mother's recovery journey and the toll that activism was taking on their family life. One evening, after a particularly heated discussion about Mary's progress in therapy, Emma confronted Luke with tears in her eyes. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly. "What if Mom goes back to using? What if all this fighting doesn't change anything?" Luke felt his heart ache for his sister. He understood her fears all too well, but also knew that giving up was not an option. "Emma," he said gently, kneeling down to meet her gaze, "we're doing this for Mom, for everyone who has suffered because of OxyContin. We can't let fear win." His words seemed to resonate with Emma. She nodded slowly, but still looked unconvinced. Luke realized then that while they were fighting an external battle against Purdue Pharma, they also needed to address the internal struggles within their family. Determined to strengthen their bond, Luke began setting aside time each week for family activities, game nights filled with laughter or movie marathons where they could escape reality for a while. He encouraged Mary to join them whenever possible. Seeing her engage with her children brought him hope that recovery was not just a distant dream, but an attainable reality. As spring turned into summer, anticipation built for a critical court hearing set to take place in just weeks. A hearing that would determine whether Purdue Pharma would face criminal charges for its role in fueling the opioid crisis. The night before the hearing, Luke gathered his family together in their living room, an impromptu meeting filled with nervous energy as they prepared for what lay ahead. "Tomorrow is going to be tough," he began solemnly but firmly. "But we have each other, and we have so many people standing with us." Mary looked at her children with pride shining through her vulnerability. She had fought hard against her addiction and was determined not just for herself, but also for them. "We're not just fighting for our family," she added softly but resolutely. "We're fighting for everyone who has been hurt by this epidemic." With renewed determination coursing through them all, they held hands tightly as Luke led them in a moment of silence. A collective promise that no matter what happened tomorrow or beyond, they would face it together. As dawn broke over Pine Hollow on the day of the hearing, a new chapter awaited them filled with uncertainty, but also hope. A turning point, not just in their fight against Purdue Pharma, but within themselves as well. The day of the court hearing dawned bright and clear, but the air was thick with tension as Luke, his family, and the coalition gathered outside the courthouse in Connecticut. The atmosphere buzzed with a mix of anxiety and determination. This was a moment they had all worked tirelessly to reach. Families affected by the opioid crisis stood shoulder to shoulder, united in their quest for justice against Purdue Pharma. And the Sacklers. As they entered the courthouse, Luke felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He glanced at his mother, Mary, who walked beside him, her expression a blend of fear and resolve. This was not just about the legal proceedings. It was about reclaiming their lives and honoring the memories of those they had lost. Each step felt heavy with significance, a reminder of everything they had endured. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted as they took their seats, the room filled with journalists and advocates eager to witness this historic moment. Luke's heart raced as he scanned the faces around him. Many were familiar, having shared their stories at community meetings or rallies. They were all here for one reason: to hold Purdue Pharma accountable for its role in the opioid epidemic. The proceedings began with opening statements from the prosecution, outlining the evidence against Purdue Pharma. Luke listened intently as lawyers presented internal documents revealing how executives had knowingly misled doctors and patients about OxyContin's risks. The weight of their words resonated deeply within him. This was not just a legal battle, but a moral one. When it was time for witnesses to take the stand, Luke felt a surge of pride as Mary stepped forward to share her story. She spoke candidly about her struggles with addiction, detailing how OxyContin had ensnared her life and affected her family. Her voice trembled at times, but she stood firm, determined to convey the truth of her experience. "I am not just a statistic," she declared passionately. "I am a mother who fought against an insidious drug that took everything from me: my health, my dignity, my family." As she spoke, tears streamed down Luke's face. He was overwhelmed by her courage and resilience. Mary's testimony struck a chord with everyone in the room, humanizing the statistics that had become so abstract in discussions about addiction. As days turned into weeks during the trial, more families took the stand, each sharing heartbreaking accounts of loss and suffering. The courtroom became a space for healing, as voices that had once been silenced found strength in solidarity. The emotional weight of their testimonies hung heavy in the air, a collective cry for justice that reverberated beyond those walls. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of waiting, it was time for closing arguments. The prosecution urged the jury to consider not just the evidence, but also the lives impacted by Purdue Pharma's greed. They painted a vivid picture of devastation, communities torn apart by addiction, and families shattered by loss. Luke sat on the edge of his seat as he listened intently. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment that could change everything for families like his own. The jury deliberated for what felt like hours before returning to deliver their verdict. Silence enveloped the courtroom as everyone held their breath in anticipation. When the foreperson finally spoke, Luke's heart raced. Guilty. The word echoed through the room like thunderclaps, a moment that would mark history. Gasps erupted from those gathered as tears of relief and joy flowed freely. Families embraced one another while others raised their fists in triumph. Luke looked at his mother, who stood frozen in disbelief before breaking into tears of joy. They hugged tightly, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief wash over them. This victory was not just theirs. It belonged to everyone who had suffered at Purdue Pharma's hands. In the weeks following the verdict, discussions about accountability gained traction nationwide. Lawsuits against Purdue Pharma multiplied as more states sought justice for their communities ravaged by addiction. The Sacklers faced mounting pressure from activists demanding transparency and accountability for their actions. For Luke and his family, life began to shift back toward normalcy. Mary continued her recovery journey while actively participating in support groups aimed at helping others find their way out of addiction's grip. Emma and Ben flourished under her renewed presence. Laughter returned to their home as they embraced each day with newfound hope. Luke remained committed to advocacy work alongside Sarah Whitaker and Dr. Reeves. Together, they formed a non-profit organization dedicated to raising awareness about addiction prevention and supporting families affected by substance use disorders. Their fight was far from over. They knew that while accountability had been achieved against Purdue Pharma, many challenges lay ahead in combating addiction across America. But now they faced these challenges with strength forged through adversity, a community bound together by shared experiences, determined never again to be silenced. As he looked out over Pine Hollow one evening, watching children play freely outside while families gathered on porches sharing laughter, Luke felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude wash over him. They had turned pain into purpose, a testament to resilience that would echo through generations yet to come. In this new chapter, filled with hope and healing amidst ongoing battles against addiction, Luke understood that every voice mattered, every story counted, and together they would continue fighting until justice prevailed for all those still suffering in silence.